A new video apparently leaked showing convicted Idaho killer Bryan Kohberger in his prison cell less than a month after he was found guilty, because he pleaded guilty, to murdering 4 University of Idaho students. The leaked footage now under investigation.
John, yes, video surfaced on the line this week showing what appears to be convicted killer Bryan Kohberger walking around in his prison cell. Authorities are now trying to figure out who initially posted this video. The Idaho Department of Corrections says they're investigating if it's real or AI generated.
On the night of November 12th, 2022, the house at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho looked like almost any other student rental on a Saturday. Lights on, music low, plans forming for later. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen, close friends since childhood, had spent part of the evening out with friends before heading home. Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin had been at a fraternity event nearby and returned to the house sometime after 1 in the morning, stopping, according to later reporting, for food along the way. 2 roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, were also in the house that night, though neither would be harmed. These were not 4 abstract victims of a headline crime. They were 4 young people in the middle of ordinary lives. Kaylee Goncalves was weeks from graduating and had already been offered a job in Texas. Madison Mogen worked at a local bar and was known among friends for her warmth and her loyalty to the people she loved. Xana Kernodle had just been initiated into her sorority's executive board and was, by every account from people who knew her, full of plans for her future. Ethan Chapin, a triplet, was inseparable from his siblings and had transferred to the University of Idaho in part to be closer to them. None of them knew each other's killer, none of them had any documented connection to him, and that absence of connection is part of what made the following weeks so unbearable for investigators and so terrifying for the community around them. Sometime in the early hours of November 13th, an intruder entered the house through a sliding door on the lower level. What followed was fast, violent, and confined largely to the upper floors of the home. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen were killed in Madison's bedroom. Xana Kernodle was killed near the top of the stairs, seemingly after encountering the intruder as he moved through the house. Ethan Chapin was killed in Xana's room. The 2 surviving roommates were unharmed, though their proximity to what happened that night would shape the rest of the investigation and the rest of their lives. The bodies were not discovered until early afternoon on November 13th, when a 911 call brought police to the house on King Road. What officers found inside set off one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in recent American history. Within hours, the story had moved from local news to national coverage, and within days, Moscow, a small college town of roughly 25,000 people, was operating under a level of media scrutiny it had never experienced. For the families of the victims, the days that followed were defined by grief layered on top of public spectacle. Funerals became national news events. Photographs of the victims, meant for yearbooks and family albums, were suddenly circulating across cable news chyrons and social media feeds. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, became one of the most visible faces of the case, speaking publicly and often about his frustration with the pace of the investigation and his determination to see his daughter's killer identified. The Mogen, Kernodle, and Chapin families, while less publicly vocal in those early weeks, were living through the same nightmare, waiting for answers that did not come quickly. And for a long stretch of that first month, there were almost no answers to give. Investigators had a crime scene, 4 victims, and very little else that pointed toward a specific suspect. There was no known relationship between the victims and anyone with a motive, no history of threats, no obvious suspect among people already connected to the house. Local police, joined quickly by the FBI and Idaho State Police, worked through tips, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence, with the entire country watching and asking the same question on repeat: who did this and why? It would take weeks before that question had an answer, and the answer would come from a source almost no one expected: a small, seemingly unremarkable object left behind at the scene. A knife sheath recovered near one of the victims, containing a trace of genetic material that investigators would eventually match to a name nobody investigating the case had heard before: a criminology PhD student living several hours away in Pullman, Washington. That single piece of evidence would become the foundation of the entire case against the man eventually arrested. The single strongest physical link prosecutors said they had between a suspect and the 4 lives taken inside that house. What almost no one could have predicted in those early weeks of grief and confusion was that the very evidence which cracked the case wide open would, years later, become the subject of a very different kind of scrutiny. One focused not on whether the right person had been caught, but on whether every step taken to prove it had been handled the way the law requires. That question would not surface during the investigation, and it would not surface during the plea and sentencing that eventually closed the case. It would surface much later, quietly, in the pages of a book almost no one was watching for. For now, in November of 2022, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was 4 names, 4 families, and a small college town trying to understand how something like this could happen at all. The investigation was just beginning, and the trail that would lead detectives to a name, a car, and a college campus 3 hours away was only starting to take shape. For nearly 7 weeks after the killings on King Road, the case moved forward largely out of public view, even as public pressure on investigators grew louder by the day. Moscow police, working alongside Idaho State Police and the FBI, faced a task force effort unlike anything the region had seen before. Sorting through hundreds of tips, hours of surveillance footage, and a flood of public speculation that often outpaced the actual investigation. Online communities dissected every scrap of available information, sometimes accurately, often not. And the families of the victims were left watching much of that speculation unfold in real time, having to relive their grief publicly while waiting for real answers. One detail investigators kept returning to was a car, a white Hyundai Elantra, captured on surveillance footage repeatedly circling the area near the King Road house in the hours before the murders. The footage showed the vehicle passing the house multiple times that night, a pattern investigators would later describe as consistent with someone studying the property before entering it. Locating the owner of that vehicle became one of the most urgent threads in the entire investigation, and it would ultimately connect the case to a name far outside the small world of Moscow, Idaho. That name was Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student in the criminal justice program at Washington State University, located just a short drive from the University of Idaho campus across the Washington and Idaho border. Investigators traced a vehicle registration connected to him, and cell phone location data placed a phone associated with him in the vicinity of the King Road house on multiple occasions in the weeks before the killings, including in the early morning hours of November 13th. For a case that had, up to that point, offered investigators almost nothing solid to work with, this was the first real thread that seemed to lead somewhere specific. Understanding who Bryan Kohberger was became just as important to the case as building the evidence against him, and his background painted the picture of a complicated, carefully constructed person rather than an obvious suspect. He grew up in the Pocono Mountains of eastern Pennsylvania, and by multiple accounts from people who knew him as a teenager, he spent those years overweight, socially isolated, and a frequent target of bullying. He described himself during that period, in his own words, as feeling essentially worthless, language that friends and former classmates would later recall with a kind of unease once his name became attached to the Idaho case. Around age 15, something in him changed, and changed quickly. Within less than a year, he lost well over 100 pounds through an intense and, by many accounts, obsessive combination of restrictive eating and punishing physical training. The transformation happened fast enough to cause serious health complications, including an eating disorder severe enough to require hospitalization. But those who knew him noticed something beyond the physical change. The quiet, withdrawn teenager who had been an easy target for years seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by someone colder, more controlled, and, to the people around him, harder to read. That pattern of reinvention did not stop there. In the years that followed, Kohberger struggled with substance use, moving from marijuana to heroin, a period his own family has since described publicly as frightening, one in which they genuinely feared losing him. He eventually pulled himself out of that period too, and rebuilt himself once again, this time around academics, intellect, and the study of criminal behavior itself. He earned degrees in psychology and criminal justice before entering the PhD program at Washington State University, where his research focused specifically on the psychology behind premeditated crime, the very category of offense he would later admit to committing. It was this version of Bryan Kohberger, composed, academically credentialed, and outwardly unremarkable, that investigators were now looking at as their primary suspect. On December 30th, 2022, law enforcement arrested him at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, where he had traveled for the holidays just weeks after the murders, and detail that struck many people as almost unbelievable given the scale of the search underway at the time. He was taken into custody without incident and extradited back to Idaho to face charges of first-degree murder and felony burglary. Kohberger's silence began almost immediately and would come to define his public presence for the next 2.5 years. At his arraignment, he declined to enter a plea at all, prompting the judge to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. He would go on to sit through pre-trial hearings, motions, and procedural battles without offering the public so much as a reaction. An unreadable composure that legal analysts and journalists covering the case would spend years trying to interpret. That same composure, the ability to present exactly the version of himself a given situation seemed to require, had in many ways already served him well long before his arrest. It had helped him move through school, through recovery, through an academic program built around studying the very behavior he was secretly capable of. What almost no one covering the case understood yet was that this same skill, the ability to perform calm control under scrutiny, would eventually be tested in an environment that did not respond to performance at all, a maximum security prison cell where there would be no audience left to convince. But that test was still years away. In the immediate aftermath of the arrest, the case against Kohberger rested heavily on one specific piece of physical evidence, a knife sheath recovered at the scene, tested for DNA, and matched back to him. Prosecutors would go on to call it the single strongest physical connection between Kohberger and the 4 victims, the anchor holding the entire case together. It was evidence that seemed at the time unshakable. It would not stay that way. Years later, that same piece of evidence, the one that had turned a criminology PhD student into the center of a national investigation, would become the focus of an entirely different kind of question, one that had nothing to do with whether the right person had been caught, and everything to do with whether the process used to prove it could withstand real scrutiny. For nearly 2.5 years after his arrest, Bryan Kohberger's case moved through the Idaho court system the way most complex capital cases do, slowly and with long stretches of procedural maneuvering rather than public drama. His defense team fought to suppress certain evidence, waived his right to a speedy trial, and worked to take the death penalty off the table. Through all of it, Kohberger himself said almost nothing in public, sitting through hearing after hearing with the same unreadable composure that had followed him since his arraignment. Then, in the spring of 2025, that trajectory shifted. Prosecutors and the defense reached a plea agreement, one that would remove the death penalty as a possible sentence in exchange for a guilty plea on every charge. The decision landed differently across the 4 families at the center of the case. Some expressed relief that their families would be spared the ordeal of a lengthy trial, one that would have forced them to relive the worst night of their lives in exhaustive public detail. Others were frustrated, feeling that a trial might have forced answers into the open that a plea deal never would. Chief among them, the question so many people still wanted resolved: why? On July 2nd, 2025, Kohberger appeared in a Boise courtroom to formally enter that plea, and the moment offered the public its first real glimpse of him in years. He wore a button-down shirt, a tie, and khaki trousers, and before proceedings began, he greeted his defense team and his parents with a warm, easy smile, an image that struck many observers as jarring, given what the room was there to confront. When Judge Stephen Hippler began asking the formal questions required to accept a guilty plea, Kohberger answered clearly and without hesitation, confirming that he had committed each killing willingly, deliberately, and with premeditation. He said yes 4 times, once for each name on the record, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. It was the first time he had spoken during any court proceeding in over 2 years. 3 weeks later, on July 23, 2025, he returned to that same courtroom for sentencing, and this time, the room belonged to the people he had spent 2.5 years refusing to acknowledge. Family members and surviving roommates delivered victim impact statements, some devastating in their grief, some sharp with anger, all of them a reminder that behind every procedural detail of the case were people who had lost permanently the people they loved most. Judge Hippler, addressing Kohberger directly, stated plainly that he could find nothing redeeming about the man standing before him. Kohberger did not react. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, 1 for each victim, along with an additional 10 years for burglary and financial penalties directed toward the families. It was, by every outward measure, the end of the legal story. But for those who had studied Kohberger's pattern of behavior over the years, the plea and sentencing looked like something else entirely, the closing of one performance and the forced beginning of another. Throughout his life, Kohberger had shown a consistent pattern of rebuilding himself whenever an existing version of himself stopped working. The withdrawn teenager who transformed his body, the young man in recovery who transformed his identity around academic achievement, the composed courtroom presence who gave nothing away for years at a time. Each version had been built for an audience, a system that responded in some way to presentation. Prison, unlike school, unlike a courtroom, unlike an academic department, was not built to respond to anyone's self-conception at all. That reality arrived quickly. 6 days after sentencing, on July 29, 2025, Kohberger was transferred from the Ada County Jail to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho, and placed in a single cell on a long-term restrictive housing unit known internally as JB Block. The conditions were exact and unyielding: 23 hours a day inside the cell, 1 hour of outdoor time in a small secured enclosure, physical restraints for any movement within the facility, showers every other day. There was no committee to present a version of himself to in that space, no academic framing that could soften the walls around him, no audience left to perform for. It did not take long for the first signs of how he would respond to that reality to surface. On July 30th, 2025, 1 day after arriving on the block, Kohberger filed his first formal written complaint. On its surface, the act of filing a complaint in prison is unremarkable. Inmates do it constantly. What stood out to the people who eventually reviewed that document was not the complaint itself, but its tone, structured, measured, addressed formally to the deputy warden, written in the language of someone requesting an outcome rather than someone who had accepted the terms of where he now was. It was a small, easily overlooked detail in the immediate aftermath of a sentencing that had already dominated headlines for weeks, but it would turn out to be the first thread in a much longer pattern, one that corrections staff, fellow inmates, and eventually the public would observe repeating itself in increasingly revealing ways over the months that followed. The composure that had carried Bryan Kohberger through interrogation, through 2.5 years of silence, through a courtroom full of grieving families, was about to meet an environment that did not care how well it was performed. Within the first month on JB Block, Bryan Kohberger had filed 5 separate formal complaints, and the pattern connecting them was more revealing than any single one on its own. There was a request to transfer out of his unit entirely, filed the day after his arrival. There was a complaint about missing items from his meal tray, filed the very next day. There was a follow-up complaint specifically about the quality of the bananas he was receiving. There were grievances about verbal harassment coming through the air vent system, connecting his cell to others nearby. Each one was written in the same structured, formally addressed language, measured, precise, and framed as though the institution around him remained obligated to respond and correct the situation. Forensic psychologists, who later reviewed these documents, were specific about what made them notable, not the fact of the complaints, but their content and tone. A person experiencing genuine psychological distress inside a maximum security prison does not typically produce a formally written grievance about the condition of a piece of fruit. Someone still operating from an internalized sense of entitlement, someone who believes the systems around him remain obligated to bend in his direction, often does exactly that. It was a small detail, but one that fit into a much larger picture that had already begun forming years earlier in a different facility entirely. During the 2.5 years Kohberger spent awaiting trial at Latah County Jail, he had been housed in close proximity to other inmates, and several of them, interviewed separately and without coordination between them, described a remarkably consistent set of behaviors. One inmate housed in the cell next to his between August and September of 2024 described him as the most intelligent person he had encountered in that facility, and almost in the same breath as intensely irritating to be near. The reason had nothing to do with intelligence. Kohberger washed his hands an extraordinary number of times each day, reportedly going through several bars of soap every week, his hands visibly red from the frequency. He spent up to an hour in the shower at a time. At night he rarely slept, pacing and moving through the hours when the rest of the unit had gone quiet, then resting during the day instead. One specific incident stood out to investigators reviewing these accounts. A neighboring inmate watching a sports game on the jail's television called out a frustrated comment at a player on screen, the kind of offhand remark people make without thinking. At that exact moment, Kohberger was on a video call with his mother in the adjacent cell. He ended the call immediately, walked to the bars, and aggressively demanded to know whether the comment had been directed at him or at her. It had been directed at neither, and the disproportion of his reaction struck the people who witnessed it as significant. Psychologists who later reviewed the documented reports described this kind of response as consistent with an acutely fragile sense of self, someone unable to tolerate even the remote possibility of being disrespected, regardless of whether any disrespect had actually occurred. That same discomfort followed him to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, though it began expressing itself through different channels. On August 4, 2025, 11 days after sentencing, Kohberger reported to a corrections officer that a fellow inmate had directed threatening statements at him through the vent system. The officer confirmed in writing that vulgar language had in fact been directed his way, but could not positively identify who was responsible, meaning no formal disciplinary action could be taken. According to a retired homicide detective with a source inside the facility, other inmates had organized a sustained, coordinated campaign of psychological pressure against him through that same vent system, taking shifts to keep it going around the clock. When Kohberger complained publicly about the conditions, the Idaho Department of Correction responded with a statement that offered him no sympathy at all, noting simply that incarcerated individuals commonly communicate with each other in prison. In other words, this is prison, and this is what prison is. Then, in mid-August of 2025, a video surfaced online that had never been meant for public release. It showed a man inside a small prison cell, cleaning his shoes slowly and methodically, the same motion repeated again and again, focused entirely on the repetition itself. The footage spread quickly across social media before the Idaho Department of Correction confirmed its authenticity and launched an internal investigation. The employee responsible for its existence resigned before that investigation concluded, and state police determined there was insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. But what the video captured, entirely by accident, was something clinicians who reviewed it described as consistent with a compulsive need to manufacture order and control through repetitive physical behavior in a space where genuine control did not exist. It was not the composed man in the button-down shirt from the courtroom. It was not the carefully worded grievance letters. It was a man alone, with no audience left to perform for. The clearest moment of all came on August 12, 2025, during a formal housing hearing before a 3-member corrections committee. Kohberger appeared prepared, presenting his case for a transfer and for protective custody status in calm, structured language, referencing the vent harassment and arguing his safety could not be guaranteed. Then, in the middle of that argument, he calmly stated that the harassment would likely fade on its own once media coverage of his case moved on. He was not expressing fear when he said it. He had already analyzed the situation, assessed the dynamics at play, and arrived at a conclusion with the detached clarity of someone studying data rather than living inside it. In that moment, the researcher in him had quietly taken over from the man who was supposedly afraid. The committee denied both requests. He returned to his cell, and nothing about his environment changed. But something else, something outside those walls entirely, had already begun taking shape. A set of questions about the very evidence that had put him there in the first place. Questions that would soon force the case back into public view for reasons no one inside J.B. Block could have predicted. In early 2026, a book quietly arrived that would end up complicating a case many people believed was already settled. Author Christopher Whitcomb, working on a project titled Broken Play, had gained access to materials that had never been presented in open court because there had never been a trial for them to be presented in. What he found inside those materials centered on the single most important piece of physical evidence in the entire case against Bryan Kohberger, the knife sheath recovered at the scene on King Road, the item whose DNA had led investigators directly to him and which prosecutors had called the anchor of their case. Before Kohberger's guilty plea, his defense team had retained forensic scientist and criminologist Brent Turvey to conduct an independent review of that evidence. Turvey's focus was narrow but significant: the chain of custody documentation, the official paper trail required by law to account for every time a piece of evidence is handled, moved, or accessed from the moment it is collected until the moment it would be presented at trial. What Turvey reportedly found was that this documentation for the knife sheath appeared to have been completed twice, once on the original evidence bag and a second time on a separate sticker later affixed to that same bag with dates and initials that did not fully align between the two versions. Turvey's conclusion, as reported by Whitcomb, was direct, that had the case gone to trial, this evidence likely should have been ruled inadmissible by a competent judge based on those irregularities alone. He went further, stating that if the DNA from the sheath had been excluded, what remained in the prosecution's case, primarily a white vehicle and cell tower location data, would have represented the single greatest obstacle prosecutors faced in securing a conviction. It is a claim that deserves to be stated with precision, and precision matters here more than almost anywhere else in this story, because none of it suggests that Bryan Kohberger did not commit these murders. He confirmed his guilt under oath, on every count, 4 separate times, once for each name on the record. This is not a question about innocence. It is a question about process, about whether the procedures used to build the case against him were followed correctly, regardless of what those procedures ultimately proved. That question did not stay contained to one book. Around the same time, a separate and seemingly unrelated thread began gaining momentum, an investigation into the extensive leaks of case information that occurred in the months before Kohberger accepted his plea deal. According to Idaho Statesman investigative reporter Kevin Fixler, an Ada County Sheriff's Office detective has been actively questioning people connected to the case as part of that inquiry, and the timing of those leaks, arriving shortly before the plea was finalized, has raised real questions about what role they may have played. It is possible, according to reporting on the matter, that the leaked material weakened the prosecution's footing, or alternately, strengthened the defense's argument that Kohberger could not receive a fair trial, given the volume of pretrial publicity surrounding the case. Either way, legal observers have noted that extensive leaks like these could become a meaningful factor if Kohberger's team ever attempts to challenge his plea on constitutional grounds, despite the plea agreement's built-in limits on his ability to appeal. Layered on top of both of these threads is a third, less certain one, unconfirmed reporting from earlier in the year, suggesting that the Idaho Department of Correction was working to transfer Kohberger out of state entirely, citing ongoing safety concerns at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. A retired homicide detective with a source inside the system has maintained publicly that the transfer is coming, while the department itself has just as publicly denied any such plan is underway. As of the most recent reporting, no transfer has occurred and no state has agreed to accept him, a genuine complication given how expensive and politically sensitive housing a high-profile inmate like Kohberger has proven to be for any receiving facility. Taken individually, none of these threads changes the outcome of the case. Taken together, they represent something more unsettling than a simple correction to the record. They suggest that a case many people assumed had reached its final form, sentencing, silence, containment is still very much in motion beneath the surface, shaped by questions about evidence handling, about information leaks, and about the ongoing management of a man who remains, in his own quiet way, one of the most closely watched inmates in the country. It is worth being clear about what this story is and what it is not. It is not an argument that the wrong man is in prison. Bryan Kohberger admitted in open court under oath that he broke into that house on King Road and killed 4 people who had never done anything to him. That fact does not change based on a chain of custody irregularity, a leaked document, or a disputed prison transfer rumor. What these threads do represent is a legitimate and important form of scrutiny, the kind that exists not to undo a conviction, but to make sure the system that produced it can withstand being looked at closely, because a justice system that cannot tolerate scrutiny of its own procedures is not one anyone should feel fully confident in, regardless of how certain the outcome may be. What remains most important in all of this are the 4 names that started this story in the first place: Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, 4 young people whose lives were taken on a single night in November of 2022, and whose families have already lived through more public scrutiny of their grief than anyone should have to endure. Whatever comes next, whether it is an appeal, a transfer, or further revelations from the ongoing leak investigation, the sentence handed down in that Boise courtroom stands, and the man responsible has already told the world, in his own words, exactly what he did. The rest is a story about whether the process that got him there holds up, and that story, unlike the case itself, is still being written.